Hey guys, tonight we're settling in with one of those wonderfully weird topics that sits at the intersection of folklore, nightmares, and medical science. So grab a blanket, maybe a questionable midnight snack, and get comfortable. Because tonight we're talking about sleep paralysis. That strange, unsettling experience where you wake up but your body refuses to cooperate. You can't move, you can't speak. Sometimes you feel like something heavy is pressing on your chest. And to make things even better, you might also hallucinate shadowy figures standing in the corner of your room, just watching you. Not creepy at all. Now, if you've had sleep paralysis, you already know it's basically your brain deciding to gaslight you for fun. But throughout history, people didn't have neuroscience textbooks to explain what was going on. Instead, they had folklore, demons, witches, and a whole lot of very creative nightmare fuel. So tonight, we're floating back through centuries of human imagination. We'll wander from ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Europe to witch trials to romantic poetry and eventually to the clinical sleep labs of the 20th century. By the end, you'll be able to smugly tell your friends, actually, the demon sitting on your chest is just your REM cycle misfiring, which is always a great party trick. But don't worry, this won't be a terrifying ride. This is bedtime history after all. We'll keep it soothing, slow, and just a little absurd. So, let's begin at the beginning. Ancient origins, when nightmares had names. The earliest written accounts of sleep paralysis come from some of the oldest civilizations. Mesopotamia, for instance, never liked to keep things boring. If you had a bad dream in Babylon, you could bet it was some demon's fault. And if you couldn't move when you woke up, well, clearly that was a demon physically holding you down. One of the culprits was Lilitu, a female demon tied to storms, sickness, and, of course, seductive danger. Because history always insists that demons need to be both terrifying and oddly glamorous. Lilitu later morphed in Hebrew mythology into Lilith, who shows up as Adam's rebellious first wife in Jewish folklore. She didn't want to listen, she didn't want to obey, and naturally, she got demonized. Literally. Over time, she became the classic night hag figure, showing up at night, paralyzing sleepers, and occasionally stealing babies. A busy schedule. So already in ancient Mesopotamia, sleep paralysis was framed as an attack. Not just, oops, my body didn't wake up right. No, someone or something was out to get you. And it would stay that way in cultural imagination for a very long time. Ancient Greece and Rome. Welcome to night terrors, but make it mythological. Let's drift over to the Greeks. If there's one thing ancient Greece loved, it was giving terrifying experiences cute little mythological mascots. Enter the Ephialtests. The word literally means the one who jumps upon you. And that's how Greek writers describe sleep paralysis, as a male spirit or daimon who leaps onto your body while you're trying to sleep. Later on, Romans just borrowed the same idea and called it the incubus, from the Latin incubare, meaning to lie on top of, which is a little on the nose. Romans weren't exactly subtle. The incubus became famous in medieval Europe as a sexual demon, but in the beginning it was just the same old problem, something sitting on you at night, leaving you unable to move. This is where we get the English word nightmare, by the way. The mare part doesn't come from horses. Sorry, no galloping ponies involved. Instead, mare was an Old English word for a crushing, night-dwelling spirit. So when you had a nightmare, you weren't just having a bad dream, you were literally being sat on by an evil presence. So basically, all across the ancient world, people experienced sleep paralysis, and all across the ancient world, they said, yup, demon, checks out. Medieval Europe, witches, devils, and the classic night hag. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and you can probably guess where this is going. When in doubt, blame witches. If you woke up in medieval Europe and couldn't move, it wasn't your nervous system misfiring. It was a witch sitting on your chest, stealing your breath, or sometimes trying to ride you like a horse. Yes, that was an actual accusation. People in the 15th and 16th centuries were really into the idea that witches went galloping off to their sabbaths on the backs of paralyzed victims. Sounds fun. Terrifying, but fun. The most common image, though, was the night hag, an old woman who crept into bedrooms, perched on your ribcage, and just stared at you while you suffocated. This idea became so widespread that it shows up in artwork. One of the most famous examples is Henry Fuseli's painting, The Nightmare, from 1781. You've probably seen it. There's a woman draped dramatically over a bed, a little goblin crouched on her chest, and a horse with glowing eyes peeking through the curtains. Because, sure, why not throw in a random nightmare horse for extra effect? That painting was practically a sleep paralysis meme before memes existed. Everyone who saw it knew exactly what it meant. That heavy, crushing feeling, that inability to scream, that absolute certainty that something was in the room with you. Fuseli just made it into art. The incubus and succubus, medieval sex demons. Medieval Christians, of course, had to complicate things further by turning sleep paralysis into a sexual problem. The incubus, who we met in ancient Rome, graduated into a demon who assaulted women in their sleep. His female counterpart, the succubus, did the same to men. And just like that, sleep paralysis became both terrifying and morally scandalous. If you admitted to feeling paralyzed at night, people might think you'd been getting visits from a demon lover, which is not really the kind of thing you want written in your parish records. So this sexualized spin is important because it shows how cultures project their anxieties onto unexplained phenomena. Couldn't move at night? Must have been sin. Must have been temptation. Clearly, the devil was involved, and conveniently, this also gave the church another reason to warn people about lust and desire. So sleep paralysis wasn't just scary. It was proof that evil forces were always lurking, ready to pounce. Literally. The witch trials. Sleep paralysis as evidence. And then came the witch hunts. If you were unlucky enough to suffer from sleep paralysis in the 16th or 17th century, you might actually end up as courtroom evidence. People testified about being ridden by witches at night. They described the exact symptoms of sleep paralysis: pressure on the chest, inability to cry out, hallucinations of figures in the dark, and judges took it as proof of sorcery. This is where things get truly bleak, because sleep paralysis, a completely natural sleep disorder, helped fuel mass hysteria. Innocent women, and men the less often, were accused of witchcraft, tortured, and executed, all because people couldn't explain why they occasionally woke up frozen in terror. So, the next time you're lying awake feeling like you can't move, just remember, at least no one's hauling you off to a witch trial. Silver linings. The early modern period. Doctors take a swing at it. By the 17th and 18th centuries, though, some people were getting a little suspicious. Not everyone was convinced that old ladies were sneaking into bedrooms to suffocate sleepers. Doctors started poking around the problem. They didn't have the right tools, but they tried. A Dutch physician named Ysbrand van Diemerbroek published a case study in 1664 where he described patients waking up unable to move, feeling a heavy weight on their chest. He called it incubus, borrowing straight from the folklore. He didn't know it was neurological, but he at least treated it like a medical issue rather than pure witchcraft. By the 18th century, physicians were increasingly skeptical of supernatural explanations. They blamed indigestion, or vapors, or blood circulation. Classic Enlightenment medicine: if you don't know what's going on, blame the stomach. But even as doctors tried to rationalize it, popular culture clung to the demonic version, which is why Fuseli's The Nightmare hit such a nerve. People in 1781 could recognize both the folklore hag and the medical curiosity. It was creepy and scientific at the same time. Romanticism and the Gothic. Nightmares become aesthetic. And then, in the 19th century, sleep paralysis found a new home: Gothic literature. Writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Mary Shelley were fascinated by dreams, nightmares, and altered states of consciousness. Sleep paralysis was perfect Gothic material. You get the terror, the uncanny imagery, the blurring of reality and dream. In fact, Coleridge supposedly experienced sleep paralysis himself and described it in his notebooks. He talked about a nightmare life and death and figures that oppressed him in bed. Romantic poets were basically sleep paralysis influencers before it was cool. So while science kept inching towards explanations, literature kept milking the drama. And honestly, that's why sleep paralysis has stayed lodged in cultural imagination. It's not just a medical oddity, it's a ready-made horror story. And that, my friends, is where we'll leave it for tonight's first stretch. From Mesopotamian demons to Gothic poetry, sleep paralysis has always carried this eerie double life, part science, part superstition. Next, we'll drift into the modern era, where Victorian doctors try very hard not to believe in demons. Freud shows up with his usual baggage, and eventually neuroscience takes over. Spoiler, the demons don't go away, they just get rebranded. But for now, let's take a breath, settle in, and remember, if you wake up tonight and can't move, it's not Lilith, it's not a witch, it's not an incubus. It's just your brain being a little dramatic. So, where were we? Yes, sleep paralysis in the age of powdered wigs, polite skepticism, and people blaming indigestion for literally everything. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, we'd entered an era when it was still fashionable to believe in ghosts, but also fashionable to deny them in front of your scientific friends. The Victorians were especially talented at this. They could sip tea, complain about nervous disorders, and still secretly believe their great-aunt Mildred had been attacked by a demon in her sleep, a delicate balancing act. This is the moment when sleep paralysis started to migrate from folklore into medical textbooks. Not always accurately, but hey, progress is progress. Victorian medicine, polite euphemisms for sheer terror. Let's start with the Victorians themselves. Victorian doctors loved categorizing things. If it moved, if it twitched, if it coughed, they gave it a Latin name and wrote 300 pages about it. Sleep paralysis was no exception. They called it nightmare, incubus, or sometimes the very dramatic nocturnal suffocative phenomena, because nothing says bedtime relaxation like suffocative phenomena. But here's the fun part. Instead of blaming witches, Victorians blamed digestion. Yes, once again, the stomach was public enemy number one. If you had sleep paralysis, the diagnosis was often a disordered stomach or flatulence of the diaphragm, which sounds less like a medical problem and more like a terrible excuse for skipping dinner parties. One 19th century physician wrote that nightmares were the result of undigested cheese pressing upon the diaphragm. And honestly, that is both completely wrong and somehow relatable. If you've ever eaten too much late-night pizza, you might feel he was onto something. Of course, they also blamed nerves. Everything in the 19th century came down to the nerves. Nervous exhaustion, nervous disorders, weak nerves, overexcited nerves. Basically, if they didn't know what caused something, it was the nerves. And sleep paralysis fit right in. So while patients were still terrified, doctors were very calmly saying things like, yes, madam, you are simply experiencing the flatulent effects of your nervous constitution, which is not exactly comforting. Spiritualism and ghost clubs. Now, to be fair, not everyone bought into the medical version. The 19th century was also the golden age of spiritualism. Seances, table-turning, mediums speaking in spooky voices. In that world, sleep paralysis wasn't indigestion. It was evidence. People would wake up paralyzed, see ghostly figures in their bedrooms, and immediately interpret it as proof of spiritual visitations. Yes, Uncle George's ghost really did visit me last night. He just stood there while I suffocated. Lovely, man. The Victorians were so into this that they actually formed ghost clubs, gentlemen's societies where upper-class men gathered in dark rooms to discuss hauntings, poltergeists, and supernatural phenomena. Sleep paralysis stories featured heavily in these debates. Was it nerves? Was it spirits? Was it both? So once again, you had this cultural double life. Doctors tried to keep things grounded in the body,
but popular culture loved the spookiness. And for most ordinary people, the ghost explanation felt more real than undigested cheese. And then, along came Freud. Because, of course he did. Sigmund Freud, the man who never met a dream he didn't want to psychoanalyze, also had opinions on nightmares and paralysis. In his 1899 book, The Interpretation of Dreams, he mentioned the night hag experience, and predictably, he linked it to repressed desires and sexuality. Because, when in doubt, Freud just said, "You wanted it." For Freud, the feeling of being pressed down in sleep paralysis was a symbolic representation of repressed urges, often, surprise, sexual in nature. That heavy weight on your chest? According to Freud, it was basically your subconscious reminding you of feelings you were too polite to acknowledge. Now, was Freud right? Absolutely not. But his ideas were incredibly influential, and they shifted the way people thought about sleep phenomena. Instead of demons, you now had guilt, repression, and inner conflict, which, honestly, doesn't sound much more fun. It also shows how adaptable sleep paralysis is. Every era molds it into whatever explanation fits best. In the Middle Ages, it was witches. In the Enlightenment, it was digestion. For Freud, it was sex. Sleep paralysis really is the ultimate cultural chameleon. Neurology gets involved. Meanwhile, as Freud was analyzing dreams, another field was slowly rising: neurology. By the late 19th century, doctors had better microscopes, better anatomy, and a growing obsession with the nervous system. They were piecing together how the brain and spinal cord actually worked, and they started to suspect that sleep paralysis wasn't stomach-related at all. One of the first neurologists to tackle the problem was Silas Weir Mitchell, an American physician who worked with Civil War veterans. He coined the term phantasmagoria of dreams to describe the vivid hallucinations that sometimes accompanied paralysis. Mitchell thought it was neurological, though he didn't yet understand REM sleep. Other doctors in Europe described similar cases. They noted that patients often woke up unable to move, but gradually regained motor function. They also noticed that hallucinations during these episodes were common, and slowly the idea of demonic attack was giving way to brain glitch. Still, neurology in the 19th century wasn't exactly gentle. This was the same era that thought rest cures and electrotherapy were good ideas. So if you went to a doctor for sleep paralysis, you might end up strapped to a machine, receiving mild shocks to your nervous system, which I imagine was not particularly restful. The early 20th century, sleep becomes a science. Now let's drift into the early 20th century, when scientists started to take sleep seriously as a field of study. Before this, sleep was just something you did, not something people thought about in laboratories. But in the early 1900s, researchers started hooking people up to electrodes and measuring brain activity. The invention of the electroencephalogram, or EEG, in the 1920s was a turning point. For the first time, scientists could actually see what the brain was doing during sleep. This is where things started to get interesting. Researchers noticed that the brain wasn't just off during sleep. It had patterns, stages, and one of those stages, later called REM sleep, was full of weird, rapid eye movement and dream activity. It took until the 1950s for REM sleep to be fully discovered and linked to dreaming. But already in the early 20th century, people suspected that sleep paralysis was connected to dreaming states. They just didn't have the full picture yet. Folklore lingers on. Even as science advanced, folklore stubbornly refused to die. In rural communities, people still talked about night hags, witches, and spirits. In Manitoba, Canada, people described being hag-ridden. In Scandinavian countries, it was the mara, the same root as nightmare. In Japan, the phenomenon was called kanashibari, meaning bound in metal. And in Ethiopia, people blamed a demon called the dukak. So even while men in white lab coats were writing about EEG waves, ordinary folks were still seeing shadowy figures at the foot of their beds and blaming supernatural forces, which makes sense. If you wake up paralyzed, your brain isn't exactly in the mood for rational neuroscience. Ghosts feel like a much quicker explanation. And of course, literature kept milking the theme. Writers in the 19th and early 20th centuries adored using sleep paralysis imagery. Gothic novels, ghost stories, even early science fiction. Paralysis in bed was a guaranteed way to unsettle readers. The sense of helplessness, the blurring of dream and reality, it was a perfect narrative device. For instance, in 1891, author George du Maurier wrote Peter Ibbetson, a novel where the protagonist learns to dream true by entering a dream state that closely resembles sleep paralysis. Later, H.P. Lovecraft, never one to pass up nightmare material, described shadowy entities that sat on sleeping victims. He even wrote a short piece called The Dreams in the Witch House, which basically reads like one long sleep paralysis episode with extra math. So even as science tried to claim the phenomenon, art kept it deliciously creepy. The split personality of sleep paralysis. By the time we reached the mid-20th century, sleep paralysis developed a kind of split personality. On one hand, you had doctors saying, "This is neurological. It's tied to sleep stages, probably REM." On the other hand, you had ordinary people saying, "I saw a shadow figure last night, and I'm pretty sure it was a demon." Both explanations coexisted, side by side. And honestly, that's still true today. You can walk into a sleep clinic and get a neat little diagram explaining your REM cycle, or you can open Reddit and find entire threads about shadow people and night hags. Humans just really like keeping both options on the table. So to wrap up this middle chapter of our journey, the Victorians politely called it flatulence of the nerves, Freud turned it into sexual repression, neurologists tried electricity, and folklorists stubbornly clung to hags and demons, all while literature kept whispering in the background, making it as spooky as possible. In other words, sleep paralysis survived the 19th and early 20th centuries exactly the way it always had. Half science, half nightmare. Next, we'll slide into part 3, where REM sleep finally takes center stage, sleep laboratories get serious, and somehow
Aliens, abductions, and UFOs sneak into the story, because apparently shadowy demons weren't dramatic enough. So, by the middle of the 20th century, sleep paralysis was still straddling two worlds. On one side, men in white lab coats were scribbling notes about abnormal sleep phenomena. On the other, perfectly ordinary people were swearing that shadow creatures, witches, or demons were creeping into their bedrooms at night. And honestly, both explanations were doing pretty well. Because the truth is, when you wake up frozen in bed, it doesn't feel like a harmless neurological quirk. It feels like something's gone horribly wrong. But around the 1950s, science started to get very serious about sleep. And that's when the story of sleep paralysis began to take a sharp turn. The discovery of REM sleep. In 1953, researchers Eugene Oserinsky and Nathaniel Kleitman made a discovery that changed everything. They were studying sleeping subjects, hooked up to EEG machines, electrodes pasted all over their heads, and they noticed something odd. During certain periods of the night, the subjects' eyes darted back and forth under their closed lids. At the same time, their brain activity looked surprisingly awake, even though they were clearly asleep. This became known as REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and it turned out to be the stage where most vivid dreaming occurs. Now here's where things click. During REM sleep, the body normally goes into something called atonia. That's just a fancy word for paralysis. Your brain literally paralyzes your muscles so you don't physically act out your dreams. Otherwise, people would be leaping out of bed every time they dreamt of running from a tiger, or worse, punching their spouse while trying to fight dream monsters. So, muscle paralysis during REM is completely normal. It's protective. It keeps us from chaos. The problem comes when your brain wakes up before your body does. Consciousness switches on, but the muscle paralysis hasn't lifted yet. And voila, sleep paralysis. Suddenly, science had a neat explanation. No witches, no cheese-induced nightmares, just a timing error between brain and body. The science of hallucinations. But wait, that doesn't explain the hallucinations. Because anyone who's experienced sleep paralysis knows it's not just about being stuck. There's also the terrifying conviction that you're not alone. The shadow figures, the presence in the room, the weight on your chest. So why does that happen? Well, scientists argue that it's basically your dreaming brain spilling into waking consciousness. During REM sleep, the brain is busy producing vivid dream imagery. If you wake up halfway, those dream images don't just vanish. They can overlap with your waking perception. Hence, shadow people lurking at the foot of the bed. As for the chest pressure, scientists explain it as the brain misinterpreting signals from the paralyzed body. Since you're lying still, breathing shallowly, and panicking a little bit, your brain invents a story to match the sensation. And the easiest story is, something heavy is sitting on me. So the whole thing is just your brain scrambling to explain what's happening. Unfortunately, it tends to scramble in the most horrifying way possible. Now, here's where things take a surprising twist. Remember, every culture creates its own explanation for sleep paralysis. In Mesopotamia, it was Lilith. In medieval Europe, it was witches. In the Victorian age, it was ghosts. And in the 20th century, well, what do people see in their bedrooms at night? Aliens. That's right. Starting in the mid-20th century, reports of alien abduction experiences skyrocketed. And if you line up the symptoms, they match sleep paralysis almost perfectly. People would describe lying in bed at night, suddenly unable to move. They felt paralyzed. They sensed a presence in the room. Sometimes they saw tall, shadowy figures with large eyes leaning over them. They often felt lifted, floated, or pulled away. And afterward, they were utterly convinced something extraordinary had happened. Sound familiar? It's basically the sleep paralysis script, just updated for the space age. In earlier centuries, people had demons and hags. In the mid-century, Americans had aliens. Aliens became the new night visitors. Betty and Barney Hill. The most famous early case is Betty and Barney Hill in 1961. The Hills claimed they were abducted by aliens in New Hampshire, examined aboard a UFO, and then returned to their car with no memory of the missing time. Under hypnosis, they recalled the whole story. Aliens, medical experiments, star maps, the works. Their case became the blueprint for modern alien abduction narratives. But when you strip away the UFO hype, a lot of their descriptions look suspiciously like sleep paralysis symptoms. Waking in the night, unable to move, vivid imagery of figures approaching, a sense of floating or being dragged, hallucinatory experiences that felt intensely real. Now, were the Hills experiencing sleep paralysis? We can't know for sure, but their story shows how cultural context shapes the way we interpret the exact same phenomenon. Medieval peasants saw witches. Mid-century Americans saw aliens. Same brain glitch, new costume. The shadow people trend. By the late 19th century, another recurring image joined the club, the shadow person. Reports poured in of people waking paralyzed and seeing dark, human-shaped figures looming at the end of the bed. Sometimes one, sometimes several, sometimes with hats. Yes, there's a whole subgenre of Hatman sightings where the shadow figure appears in a fedora. Apparently, the supernatural has questionable fashion sense. Again, these reports overlap with classic sleep paralysis hallucinations. The figures don't speak, they don't usually move much, they just stand there, watching. Which, let's be honest, is the creepiest thing of all. Scientists explain it as the brain's threat detection system going haywire. When you wake up paralyzed, your brain panics. It assumes danger. But because you can't see any actual danger, it invents one. And the easiest thing for the brain to imagine is a human-shaped intruder. Hence, shadow people. Of course, knowing that doesn't make it feel any less real when you're lying there at 3 a.m. Sleep clinics and case studies. Meanwhile, in the 1970s and 80s, sleep science blossomed. Laboratories popped up all over the world.
Researchers wired volunteers to EEGs, EKGs, oxygen monitors, and videotaped them through the night. And guess what? Sleep paralysis showed up in the data. Doctors documented people transitioning from REM sleep to wakefulness while their bodies were still paralyzed. They confirmed that hallucinations were part of the REM intrusion. They gave it an official name, isolated sleep paralysis. For the first time in history, sleep paralysis was recognized as a legitimate sleep disorder. Not demons, not witches, not aliens. Just REM atonia hanging around too long. But the science didn't kill the folklore. In fact, both kept thriving side by side. People read medical explanations in one hand and ghost stories on Reddit with the other. Because deep down, most of us kind of enjoy the mystery. Pop culture loves it. Naturally, pop culture couldn't resist. Sleep paralysis showed up in movies, TV shows, and books. Horror films leaned heavily on the night hag trope. Documentaries linked it to alien abductions. Writers described shadow people as though they were real entities. Even Netflix got in on the act with shows exploring the phenomenon. It makes sense. Sleep paralysis is ready-made for storytelling. It has fear, it has helplessness, it has creepy imagery, and it comes with built-in ambiguity. Was it your brain, or was it something else? Perfect entertainment material. So why does it feel so real? Let's slow down for a second and ask the obvious question. If this is all just brain chemistry, why does it feel so utterly convincing? The answer lies in the way our brains process reality. During REM sleep, the same brain regions that handle vision, emotion, and sensory input are active. So when hallucinations spill into wakefulness, they don't feel like dreams. They feel like actual perception. Combine that with the panic of being unable to move, and the brain basically screams, "This is real and it's happening right now." No wonder people walk away swearing they saw a ghost or a demon or an alien. So, yes, it's an illusion, but it's one of the most persuasive illusions the human brain can generate. The ongoing mystery. Even today, sleep paralysis sits in this strange in-between space. On one hand, science has explained it in detail. We know about REM atonia, we know about hallucinations, we know it's harmless, if unsettling. On the other, folklore and personal testimony continue to thrive. People still wake in the night, frozen, convinced that something stood beside them. And who can blame them? In the moment, it's not science that speaks to you. It's the sheer visceral terror of the experience. Science might catch up later, in the morning, over coffee, but at night, it's still shadow people all the way. So, in this chapter, we've seen sleep paralysis step fully into the modern world. From REM sleep discovery in the lab, to aliens in New Hampshire, to shadow people in fedoras, it keeps reinventing itself for every cultural moment. Next, in Part 4, we'll ease into the 21st century, where neuroscientists refine the research, psychologists explore the cultural dimensions, and YouTube, naturally, becomes full of people swearing they were visited by demons last Tuesday. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that sleep paralysis never really goes away. It just changes costumes.
So, we've wandered through Mesopotamian demons, medieval witches, Freud's questionable theories, Victorian cheese-induced nightmares, and even aliens with suspiciously shiny spacecraft. And now we've landed in the present day. Welcome to the 21st century, the age of neuroscience, MRI machines, TikTok ghost stories, and WebMD convincing you that you're dying every time you sneeze. And naturally, sleep paralysis has come along for the ride. Still misunderstood, still terrifying, still wearing different costumes depending on who's telling the story. But at least now we have brain scans, data sets, and psychology journals to keep things a little more grounded. The neuroscience of sleep paralysis. Let's start with the serious side, what the scientists say. Modern neuroscience has sleep paralysis pinned down to REM sleep intrusion. We already touched on this in the last part, but let's slow it down a bit. During REM sleep, your body is paralyzed. That's normal. The brainstem sends signals to inhibit motor neurons, and your muscles basically take a nap while your brain dreams up whatever nonsense it feels like. Running through forests, fighting dragons, having deeply awkward conversations with your middle school math teacher, it all happens while your body is locked down for safety. Sleep paralysis happens when your conscious awareness returns before the paralysis lifts. You wake up, your bedroom is right there. Your brain is alert, but your body is still offline. And your brain does what it always does, tries to make sense of it. Only instead of calmly saying, this is a benign neurological state, it goes, help, intruder, demon, death. Add to this a flood of REM-related dream imagery, and you get the classic hallucinations. Shadow figures, pressing weights, whispering voices, basically, your dream machinery leaking into waking reality. Brain imaging studies. In the last 2 decades, researchers have even put people through brain imaging experiments to study these episodes. Not easy, since you can't just order someone to have sleep paralysis on demand, but in carefully controlled sleep labs, some unlucky volunteers have managed to produce it under observation. What do the scans show? The amygdala lights up. That's the brain's fear center. It basically screams, danger, the moment paralysis is detected. Visual and motor areas misfire, leading to the hallucinations of figures and the sense that you should be moving but can't. The parietal lobe gets confused. That's the part of your brain that maps where your body is in space. When it glitches, you get that floating or out-of-body feeling. So what feels like a demon sitting on your chest is really just your amygdala and parietal lobe playing an extremely unfun prank. Psychology and stress. Of course, neuroscience isn't the whole story. Psychology has had a lot to say too. Studies show that sleep paralysis is strongly linked to stress, anxiety, irregular sleep schedules, and trauma. College students pulling all-nighters? High rates. People with PTSD? Also high rates. Shift workers? Yep. Basically, if your sleep gets messed up, your odds of experiencing paralysis shoot up. One study even found that about 1 in 5 people will experience sleep paralysis at least once in their lives. So if it's happened to you, congratulations, you're statistically normal. Terrified, yes, but normal. Psychologists also point out how culture shapes the content of the hallucinations. In Italy, people often report seeing witches. In Japan, it's ghosts or spirits. In the US, shadow people or aliens. In Egypt, it's sometimes interpreted as jinn. Same neurological glitch, different cultural wallpaper. So while the brain provides the raw material, your cultural background supplies the special effects department. Internet age folklore. Now let's glide into the fun part, the internet. Because if there's one thing the internet loves, it's terrifying personal stories at 3 a.m. Sleep paralysis has become an online legend all its own. Reddit, for example, has entire communities dedicated to shadow people and night hags. People post their stories. I woke up and saw a man in a hat standing in my doorway. A black figure sat on my chest for what felt like hours. I heard voices whispering, but no one was there. And, of course, the comments sections are a mix of, "That's classic sleep paralysis, totally normal. Bro, that was a demon. Actually, the Hat Man has followed me since childhood." So yes, while science may have explained it, the internet is zero interest in letting go of the folklore. TikTok takes it even further. People make animated recreations of their paralysis episodes. They dramatize shadow figures with glowing eyes, set it to eerie music, and rack up millions of views. Nothing says bedtime relaxation quite like algorithmically recommended demon content. The Hat Man phenomenon. Speaking of shadow people, let's pause on one of the strangest internet-age subplots, the Hat Man. Reports of shadow figures wearing wide-brimmed hats have exploded online. Thousands of people claim to have seen them during sleep paralysis episodes.
Always male, always in a hat, usually just standing there. Why a hat? No one knows. Some say it's cultural memory of old-fashioned figures, Victorian gentlemen, undertakers, even cowboys. Others think the hat just makes the shadow look scarier, more defined. Psychologists argue it's just a reoccurring archetype. When the brain invents shadow figures, it sometimes adds accessories. But for people who've seen him, the experience is unforgettable. There's even a mini-genre of horror films and podcasts dedicated to the Hat Man. So yes, while medieval peasants had witches, we now have a demon in questionable headwear. Progress. Paranormal and religious interpretations. Even today, many people prefer supernatural explanations. Some religious groups see sleep paralysis as demonic attack, a test of faith, or spiritual warfare. Others interpret it as visits from ancestors, spirits, or jinn. Online forums are full of prayers, rituals, and advice on how to ward off nighttime visitors. And honestly, that makes sense. Science explains the mechanics, but it doesn't erase the raw emotional punch of the experience. When you wake up frozen, heart racing, sure that something's in the room, REM intrusion doesn't feel like the right explanation. The supernatural still feels closer to the truth, which is exactly why folklore refuses to die. It's not about facts, it's about how the experience feels. The gentle side of sleep paralysis. But it's not all terror. Some people actually find positive sides. Yes, really. A small percentage of people use sleep paralysis as a gateway to lucid dreaming or out-of-body experiences. Instead of panicking, they try to relax and slip into dream control. Some even train themselves to trigger sleep paralysis on purpose, something I personally would not recommend, but hey, to each their own. There are entire communities online swapping tips on how to turn paralysis into astral projection or mystical journeys. Whether or not you believe in that, it shows how flexible the phenomenon is. One person's nightmare is another's spiritual playground. Coping in the 21st century. So what do modern doctors recommend if you're not thrilled about surprise shadow visitors? Pretty boring stuff, actually. Keep a consistent sleep schedule, reduce stress, avoid caffeine or heavy meals before bed. Sleep on your side instead of your back. In other words, the usual lifestyle advice that makes everyone sigh. But studies do show that reducing stress and improving sleep hygiene can lower the chances of paralysis episodes. If episodes are frequent and severe, doctors might even prescribe medication, usually something that adjusts REM sleep cycles. But for most people, reassurance is enough. Knowing it's not a demon, not a ghost, not aliens in a spaceship, and not even the Hat Man in his questionable headwear, it's just your brain, half asleep, half awake, trying to make sense of itself. But if you prefer to blame demons, that's fine too. You'll be in good company, with about 5,000 years of human history nodding along beside you.
So here we are. We've wandered across 5,000 years of human imagination, medicine, and midnight panic attacks. From Mesopotamian demons with very bad reputations, to medieval hags pinning peasants down in their straw beds, to Freud taking notes and probably overanalyzing everything, and finally, to modern scientists with electrodes strapped to unlucky volunteers. And now, we're at the end. The room is quiet. Hopefully, your lights are low. Maybe your blankets are tucked just right. Let's take one last gentle walk through this strange history before you drift away. The timeless human experience. One of the strangest things about sleep paralysis is how universal it is. People on every continent, in every time period, in every religion and culture, from Babylonian priests in linen robes to Reddit posters typing in the dark at 3 in the morning, the experience is basically identical. You wake, you can't move, you feel something pressing down on your chest, and you sense, beyond reason, that you're not alone. It's the same script, same feelings, same fear. The only difference is what mask we give the visitor. Demon, witch, succubus, alien, shadow person.
Whatever the culture already believes in, that's the costume the paralysis wears. There's something oddly comforting about that, because it means you're not alone. If you felt it, you're part of a chain that stretches back through centuries. Millions of people, frozen in the dark, whispering about their experiences the next morning. Folklore as a coping mechanism. Why does folklore cling so tightly to this one phenomenon? Probably because sleep paralysis is an event that feels more like attack than glitch. Science can measure the brain activity. We can nod along and say, yes, yes, REM intrusion, heightened amygdala response, sensory misfiring. But in the middle of the night, when it's happening, you don't feel a science. You feel hunted. So humans have always reached for explanations that make emotional sense. Witches, night hags, jinn, demons, even aliens in silver suits. These stories aren't just superstition, they're survival strategies. They give shape to the formless. They make the terror feel less random. Folklore is, in a way, our brain's second attempt at explanation. If the neurons can't make sense of it, the stories will. The sleepy humor of history. Looking back, it's hard not to notice how many of these interpretations are unintentionally funny. The medieval night hag, for example. Imagine waking up paralyzed, and your conclusion is, yes, of course, a local witch broke in through my window, climbed onto my chest, and is riding me like a horse. Naturally. Makes perfect sense. Or the Victorian doctors with their cheese theory. Because clearly, a bit of Stilton before bed is enough to summon ghosts. Or the aliens of the 20th century, who apparently had nothing better to do than paralyze random suburban Americans and poke them with glowing sticks. Even today, with the internet's obsession over the Hat Man, it's hard not to smirk. A shadow figure? Terrifying. A shadow figure in a fedora? Slightly less so. Almost like your sleep paralysis is being haunted by a rejected film noir character. But that's what makes the whole thing so oddly charming. Sleep paralysis is frightening, yes, but when you zoom out across centuries, it's also deeply, hilariously human. Our brains glitch, and we invent folklore costumes to dress it up. Science and the reassurance of knowing. The modern age does have one real advantage, though. We understand what's happening, at least to some degree. The next time it happens, you can remind yourself. Your brain is just misfiring. Your body will unlock in a few seconds. The figure in the corner isn't real. The crushing weight on your chest is just an overactive amygdala and maybe some shallow breathing. Of course, this doesn't always help in the moment. Panic is stubborn. But sometimes, a little scientific reassurance can soften the edges. You're not cursed. You're not possessed. You're not being abducted by alien dentists. You're just caught in the middle of a sleep cycle. That knowledge is calming. It takes the teeth out of the experience, even if the shadow figures still linger at the edges. Why we're fascinated. Even if you've never experienced sleep paralysis, you've probably heard someone talk about it. And when they do, you lean in, because the idea is irresistible. It sits at the crossroads of science and myth. It's psychological, but also spiritual. It's terrifying, but also mundane. It's as old as civilization, but alive on TikTok. That's probably why people keep making art about it. Paintings of night hags in the 1700s, horror movies in the 20th century, creepy YouTube animations in the 21st. We can't stop dressing it up, retelling it, reshaping it. Sleep paralysis is basically folklore's greatest long-running franchise. Longer than Dracula, older than Frankenstein, a nightmare rebooted in every era. The bedtime perspective. And maybe that's where we'll leave it tonight, with the gentle reminder that sleep paralysis is just another strange quirk of the human mind. It's not a curse, it's not proof of spirits, it's not the government testing alien technology, it's just your brain stumbling between sleep and waking, with a dash of cultural storytelling sprinkled on top. The next time it happens, if it happens, You can take a slow breath and think, ah, yes, I'm experiencing the same thing as Assyrian priests, medieval peasants, Freud's confused patients, and half the internet. Not exactly comforting, but at least you're in good company. And while the shadow in the corner might look menacing, remember, it's just a costume. A hag, a demon, a hat-wearing man. Your own brain's trickster at play. Nothing more, nothing less. A soft exit. So, as we close, let's slow everything down. Picture yourself not in a haunted bedroom, but somewhere safer. Maybe an old library, filled with worn books, or a quiet monastery, candles flickering against stone walls, or just your own room. A little cooler now, a little darker, a little quieter. The demons and hags and aliens can all take the night off. They've had 5,000 years of work. They deserve a break. And so do you. Let your body feel heavy. Let your breath soften. If your brain wants to invent shadow figures, that's fine. They'll fade soon enough. You're safe, you're grounded, you're here. And with that, we've reached the end of the story. A history of sleep paralysis, from demons to science to you, drifting off now into something deeper, calmer, and hopefully dreamless. Good night.
So you're still here, still awake, or at least half awake. Maybe your eyes are heavy, but your mind is floating, which is fine, because that's exactly the place where this story belongs, somewhere between waking and sleeping. The same space where sleep paralysis itself lives. Tonight, we've traced its history, from clay tablets to TikTok. But there's always something left unsaid. A few threads still hanging. A few musings that don't quite fit into the neat academic timeline. This last part isn't about facts and dates. It's more about letting your thoughts wander. A world connected by nightmares. If you think about it, sleep paralysis is one of the strangest ways humans are connected. Forget languages, forget politics, forget geography. Whether you're a farmer in medieval France, a student in modern Tokyo, or a monk in ancient Tibet, you might wake up in the same frozen terror. It's a little like a secret club. No one volunteers for membership. No one wants to be initiated. But once you've had the experience, you recognize it in others instantly. The way they describe the weight on their chest, the shadow in the doorway, the certainty that something was there, you know they're telling the truth. That universality makes it different from most other conditions. If you catch a cold in 1300, your remedies will look nothing like someone's remedies in 2025. But if you describe sleep paralysis in 1300, someone in 2025 nods and says, yes, exactly that. The poetry of fear. There's also something poetic about the way every culture has dressed it up. Not just demons or hags, but real imagery, sometimes even beautiful in its own dark way. A Babylonian demon with wings and claws drawn carefully into clay. A Norse Mara galloping unseen into houses at night. An Italian Striga slipping in through the shutters. A Victorian hag captured in oil paint crouched on the chest of some dramatically posed dreamer. A shadow man in a wide hat lingering forever in modern stories. These are frightening images, yes, but also strangely artistic. Humans can't seem to leave the experience raw. We sculpt it, paint it, narrate it, dramatize it. We make our nightmares into art because maybe that's the only way to own them. And why night hags never retire? And here's the curious thing. Despite all our science, the folklore refuses to retire.
You'd think once we discovered REM sleep intrusion and amygdala spikes, the hags and demons would politely exit. But no, they're still hanging around. Even if you know the neuroscience, when paralysis strikes, it doesn't feel like REM intrusion. It feels like an intruder, a presence, something realer than real. And so the myths stay alive. Not as literal truth, but as emotional truth. It's as if the folklore speaks to the heart, while science speaks to the head. Both valid, both useful, but only one actually comforts you at 3 in the morning. The strange gift of the experience. Now here's a thought you don't often hear. Some people see sleep paralysis as a gift. Strange, terrifying, but a gift all the same. Why? Because it forces you into the most intense awareness of being alive. Few things remind you of your body and your mind more sharply than waking up unable to move with your heart pounding and your senses scrambled. In that moment, you realize how fragile consciousness is, how thin the line is between dream and reality, how mysterious the brain still is, even in the age of MRI scans. And some people learn to lean into that mystery, to treat paralysis as a doorway into lucid dreaming, to ride it like a wave into new states of awareness, to make peace with the shadows, instead of fighting them. That doesn't mean everyone should embrace it, but it's a reminder. Not all nightmares are wasted. Some become turning points. The Night Watchers. Another way to think about it, sleep paralysis is humanity's reminder that we are never entirely in control. You can organize your life, plan your days, tidy your house, but when the night comes, the brain does what it wants. The watchers in the corner of your room, they're part of you. Not invaders, not enemies, just your own mind wearing a cloak, testing the edges of perception. See, in that way, the experience changes. Less demon breaking in, more a shadow of myself reminding me to rest. The hag becomes a teacher. The alien becomes a symbol. The shadow man becomes just another tired companion stuck in the liminal zone between dreams and waking. History as a kind of lullaby. And this, maybe, is why telling the history of sleep paralysis works as a bedtime story. Because history itself is a kind of lullaby. Every generation has told this story. The names changed, the costumes changed, but the plot stayed the same. By walking through that long history, we remind ourselves that we're part of something bigger, that the strange isn't just personal, it's universal. And maybe that makes it less scary. Because when you close your eyes tonight, and if your brain decides to throw you into paralysis, you'll know. Thousands of years of humans have gone through the same thing. They survived. You will too. A closing picture. So let's end with a picture. Not a demon this time, not a hag, not a shadow figure, something calmer. Picture a long, quiet hallway. At the end of it, there's a door. You walk through it. On the other side, a vast library, shelves stretching into the dark. Each book, a dream. Each candle, a memory.
Somewhere in those shelves, the record of your own night terror sits quietly. But beside it are millions more. Whole histories of frozen nights, flickering shadows, pounding hearts. And somehow, that makes yours feel lighter. Just one book on one shelf in an infinite library. Nothing to fear. Nothing to carry alone. So you take a deep breath, you close the book, you leave it on the shelf, you step out of the library, back into the quiet night. The shadows stay behind. The weight lifts. Your body softens. And then you let go. If you're still with me, Still listening, still drifting in that halfway place? Congratulations. You've now heard more about sleep paralysis than most people ever wanted to. And yet, strangely, the story still doesn't feel finished. That's because sleep paralysis, like sleep itself, is never really finished. It repeats. It lingers. It hides in corners, waiting for another night. The history doesn't end, it just keeps recycling through new dreamers. So let's take one more long, slow wander. Not through strict history this time, but through reflections, images, and fragments. A history not of facts, but of feelings. A soft, scattered addendum for anyone who hasn't quite fallen asleep yet. Shadows that travel. One curious thought: the shadow figures that haunt sleep paralysis don't belong to one person. They travel. A shadow hag crouched on a chest in 14th century Florence. A cloaked demon standing by a bed in 9th century Baghdad. A fedora-wearing silhouette leaning in the corner of a suburban Texas bedroom in 2005. Different people, different languages, different centuries, but the same figure recycled. It's almost like the shadow itself is immortal, passed along through our shared imagination. A cultural hitchhiker, carried in whispers and art, and now in internet posts. You could almost say sleep paralysis produces the only ghost that's truly real. Not an entity, but an experience so common it becomes global folklore. The noise of night. Another thought. Notice how often people report sounds during paralysis. Whispers, footsteps, breathing, buzzing. These sounds are illusions, of course, just neurons firing where they shouldn't. But they always sound so deliberate, so personal, as if the shadow in the room has a voice but chooses to mumble instead of speak. Imagine that. Thousands of people across time hearing the same whispers in the night. None of them real, and yet all of them meaningful. Almost like a secret language spoken only in that frozen state. If dreams are the theater of the sleeping mind, then sleep paralysis is its backstage, where the ropes creak, the actors shuffle, and the whispering never stops. A gentle reversal. But what if we flipped the perspective? What if instead of the shadows watching you, it's you who is intruding into their space? Think about it. You're halfway asleep, halfway awake. Maybe that liminal zone doesn't just belong to you. Maybe the figures you see are as startled by you as you are by them. Maybe they think you're the shadow. It's an odd, comforting thought. Instead of being hunted, you're just another accidental visitor in a shared hallway of consciousness. The hag, the demon, the shadow, they're not attackers, just neighbors, surprised to see you at this hour. And like most neighbors, they're probably hoping you'll go back to bed soon. A history of beds. Beds themselves could tell the story too. A straw mat in a medieval hut, creaking as a peasant froze in terror. A noble's four-poster bed, with curtains pulled tight, trapping both air and fear. A narrow monk's cot, where chanting by day turned to silent struggle by night. A Victorian featherbed, where indigestion and superstition intertwined. A modern mattress with memory foam, glowing faintly from the phone charging beside it. The beds change, the materials change, but the paralysis doesn't. It presses down equally whether you're sleeping on straw or spring coils. It's democratic in its own cruel way. Kings and beggars both wake to the same frozen terror. The weight of silence. Maybe the strangest part of paralysis isn't the shadows at all. It's the silence. That heavy, humming silence that fills the room. The kind where every second stretches too long. You can't cry out. You can't move. You can't even shift the air. The silence becomes a weight all its own. Some people describe it as suffocating, others as peaceful. But everyone agrees it doesn't feel like ordinary silence. It feels charged, almost alive. And maybe that's why cultures always interpret it as a presence, because silence that heavy can't just be nothing. It feels like something is waiting, watching, listening. When the hag gets bored. Another sleepy musing. What if the hag gets bored? Imagine her sitting down for work centuries ago. Night after night, pressing on people's chests, whispering threats, looming dramatically. And over the centuries, humans stop fearing her quite as much. Doctors explain her away. Artists make her look almost comical. YouTubers turn her into clickbait. Maybe she sighs, adjusts her robes and thinks, what's the point? Maybe one night she doesn't even bother sitting on a chest. She just stands in the corner and stares. Less effort, same effect. And eventually, she upgrades her look with a fedora just to keep things interesting. The comfort of continuity. And here's the part worth holding on to. Continuity. Because whether or not you believe in demons or science, whether you frame it as REM intrusion or spiritual warfare, sleep paralysis is a link, a living, ongoing thread. It means you share something with ancient priests, medieval villagers, Enlightenment scholars, and modern teenagers. It's not a pleasant thing to share, but it's connection nonetheless. In a lonely world, even fear can be a bridge. A final drift. So, as this long history settles down, let's try to leave the shadows behind. Picture them fading, not vanishing violently, just dissolving into the dark like mist. The hag sets down her burden. The demon closes the door. The alien powers down the spaceship. The hat man tips his brim and walks away. And you're left with nothing but quiet. Just the rhythm of your breathing, the soft pull of sleep tugging at your body, the gentle realization that you are safe, you are whole, and the shadows are only shadows. The very end. And that really is the end now. The end of the story, the end of the history, the end of the parade of hags and demons and poorly dressed shadow men. If you're still awake, that's fine. Let your thoughts keep flowing. But if you're not, if you've already slipped into dreams, then this history has done its job. Either way, the night is yours now, and the shadows, if they visit, will be softer. Good night. Truly, this time, good night.
If you're still here, still awake, still letting the story wash over you, well, that's impressive. Most people probably drifted away back in the Middle Ages, when demons were piling up faster than footnotes. But you've stayed. You've lingered. You've walked through the entire shadowy gallery with me. And now we're in the quiet zone, the part of the night where thoughts don't really line up anymore, but drift like leaves in slow water. That's where part 8 belongs. Less about information, more about gentle echoes. The shadows that follow history. One last reflection. The shadows don't just belong to bedsides. They belong to history itself. Think of it. Every era of human civilization has its bright spots. Art, music, literature, inventions. But alongside all that, there are always shadows. Wars, plagues, famines, secrets. Sleep paralysis is almost like a tiny personal version of history itself, a reminder that the dark never leaves, that every golden age has its night terrors, that even when you're safe, your own mind keeps old fears alive. And maybe that's why we keep retelling the story, because it feels true, not just to the body, but to history itself. Half-dreams as archives. Another thought. Perhaps half-dream states are the real archives of humanity. Yes, we have libraries and museums filled with objects and words, but what about the intangible things? The fears that never get written down? The images that flash only in the brain's twilight zone? Maybe the shared hallucinations of paralysis are like a hidden museum, a place where all the fears of all the ages sit together. Demons from Mesopotamia, next to witches from Europe, next to aliens from Roswell, next to hat-wearing silhouettes from the suburbs. Not organized, not labeled, just floating in the same dim space. A nightmare archive that every sleeper visits sooner or later. The odd kindness of the experience. Here's a strange idea. Maybe sleep paralysis is kinder than it seems. Yes, it's terrifying in the moment. The weight, the shadows, the silence. But it always ends. It always fades. It never kills you. It never breaks you. It just frightens you and then lets you go. Other conditions don't do that. Pain lingers. Illness drains. Grief lingers for years. But paralysis? It vanishes in seconds. It's a visitor who never overstays, a storm that passes before you can even shout. And sometimes after it leaves, you feel oddly grateful. Shaken, yes, but also aware. Aware of your body, your breath, your heartbeat, reminded of your fragility and of your survival. The night as teacher. Maybe that's the real lesson, that the night teaches us, even when we don't want to learn. Daytime teaches through lectures, through books, through conversations, but the night teaches through silence, through paralysis, through shadows. Lessons you can't write down, only feel. One lesson, you're not in control. Another, your fears are older than you. And another still, shadows are not always enemies. Sometimes they're just parts of yourself you haven't greeted yet. Not comfortable lessons, but valuable ones. Imagining the hag as a librarian. And here's a whimsical idea before the night ends. What if the night hag isn't a tormentor at all, but a librarian? Picture her sitting at the foot of your bed, not to crush you, but to open a book. She reads silently, and you feel the weight of her presence as the weight of history itself. You're frozen, not because she's malicious, but because she's holding you still while you listen. Her whispers aren't curses. They're footnotes, citations, little reminders that you belong to a tradition much bigger than yourself. The hag as librarian, the shadow as archivist, the alien as a wandering researcher. Suddenly, the whole nightmare shifts into something softer. Not an attack, just a midnight lecture you didn't sign up for. The gentle absurdity of fear. And maybe that's the best way to hold the whole thing, with a touch of humor. Because really, think about how absurd it is. Humans, across thousands of years, all waking up and saying, "A witch rode me like a horse. A demon crouched on my chest. An alien poked me with glowing tools. A hat-wearing silhouette stared at me." It's terrifying in the moment, but in hindsight, it's almost silly. And maybe that's the best medicine. To laugh, gently, at the shared ridiculousness of our fragile, frightened brains. Because if you can chuckle at the hag, she loses her teeth. If you can smile at the Hat Man, he's just a shadow in bad fashion. Humor doesn't erase the fear, but it softens it. And softness is all you need when you're drifting towards sleep. So let's do one more drift. Picture yourself walking through a series of quiet rooms, each one holding a different era of paralysis. The Babylonian room, clay tablets stacked high, demons sketched in jagged lines, a priest muttering incantations in the corner. The medieval room, straw beds, smoky air, hags painted into woodcuts, a villager clutching a rosary, eyes wide. The Victorian room, thick curtains, too much wallpaper, a doctor scribbling notes while someone insists the cheese was to blame. The modern room, a glowing laptop, Reddit open, someone typing, "Has anyone else seen the Hat Man?" And finally, your own room, whatever it looks like, whatever shadows live there, the last room in the long museum. And the door quietly closes. The slowest goodbye. And with that, we're truly at the slowest part of the night. The point where words don't need to teach anymore. They just need to drift, like clouds dissolving in a twilight sky. So I'll leave you here, with your breath, with your room, with your shadows if they come. They're quieter now, softer, almost friendly. And if they linger, let them. They're just echoes of a very old story, a story that doesn't end but repeats. And tonight, it's simply your turn to dream it. Sleep well, sleep gently, and if the hag visits, tell her she's late for her shift at the library. Good night.
If you're still here, still listening, still letting my voice follow you into the late hours, then you've made it further than most. You've walked through the whole strange, shadowy history of sleep paralysis. You've met demons, hags, monks, doctors, and even aliens in bad hats. And now there's nothing left to do but linger. Because at this point, the story has already ended. We're just sitting in the after silence, the calm that follows a storm, the hum that remains after the music is stopped. This part is not about facts, not even about history. It's about the soft, drifting leftovers, the thoughts that arrive when the mind is too tired to make lists, too heavy to organize, and too calm to care. The endless corridor. Imagine history itself as a corridor, long, dim, lined with doors. Behind one door, the Babylonians, carving demons into clay. Behind another, medieval villagers, praying against hags. Another, Enlightenment scholars, squinting at medical diagrams. Another, modern dreamers, tapping posts into glowing screens. And at the end of the corridor, your own room, your own bed, your own breath. When you wake frozen in the night, you are not alone. You are simply walking in the same corridor, opening the same door that billions of people have opened before. That's the quiet comfort of it. The corridor never ends, and you are part of it now. The Museum of Shadows. Or maybe it isn't a corridor. Maybe it's a museum. Every culture has donated something to the exhibit. The Sumerians, clay demons with wings. The Greeks, tales of gods visiting by night. The Europeans, hags with wild hair and sharp elbows. The modern world, aliens with cold eyes and sharper tools. All displayed side by side. The same fear, dressed in different costumes. And wandering through this museum, you can't help but notice It's oddly repetitive. The shapes blur together. The shadows start to look the same. It makes you wonder whether the human imagination is less creative than we think. Maybe the mind has a very small wardrobe and it keeps recycling outfits for the same old fear. The slow trick of breathing. If you've ever been frozen by paralysis, you know the trick. Focus on your breathing. In, out. In, out. The weight feels heavy, but the breath keeps moving. And eventually, slowly, the body lets go. The paralysis fades, the shadows dissolve. The room is just a room again. That rhythm, inhale, exhale, is the softest medicine of all. And maybe that's why the experience exists, to remind us of something so simple, so basic, we often forget. Breath is proof. Proof you're alive. Proof you're safe. Proof you can return to calm no matter how heavy the night feels. If history could sleep. Now picture this. If history itself could sleep, what dreams would it have? Would the Roman Empire dream of roads stretching forever? Would the medieval ages dream of bells ringing across endless fields? Would the modern 20th century dream of glowing screens multiplying like fireflies? And when history rolled into sleep paralysis, what would it see? Perhaps a giant shadow crouched on the chest of the world, not cruel, just heavy, the weight of time pressing down, the frozen silence of centuries refusing to move. And maybe history, like us, just has to wait for the moment to pass, until movement returns. The funny thing about fear. Here's a curious truth. Fear never feels funny in the moment, but afterwards, looking back, it often does. That villager who swore a hag sat on his chest, terrified, but centuries later, we can't help but smirking at the image. That Victorian who blamed cheese for a night terror, sincere but oddly comical. Even now, someone posting online, I saw a man in a hat just standing there. And thousands of strangers replying, yeah, me too. It's eerie, but it's also just a little ridiculous. Fear ages badly. It decays into humor, which means even the worst night terrors eventually become bedtime stories. That's comforting in its own way. The shadows as mirrors. Maybe the shadows aren't even visitors. Maybe they're mirrors. When you see the hag, you're seeing your own dread. When you see the alien, you're seeing your own distance from the world. When you see the Hat Man, maybe you're just seeing the outline of your own uncertainty. The shadow isn't other. It's you, refracted back at yourself in a form you don't quite recognize, like a mirror in a dark room, showing only outline, not detail. And if that's true, then the shadow isn't something to fear. It's simply yourself, waiting patiently for acknowledgement. The final drift through night. So, let's drift one last time. Picture the world in darkness. Not threatening darkness, just quiet night, stretching across fields, oceans, cities, mountains. Billions of people sleeping. Billions of minds wandering. Some dream peacefully, some toss and turn, some wake in frozen terror, some never notice anything at all. And through it all, shadows wander like slow travelers, not in one place, not in one time, but moving softly across centuries, across continents, visiting here, visiting there, always fading, always dissolving. And when the sun rises, they vanish completely. Until the next night, until the next dreamer, until you. The soft goodbye. And that really is the end. Not a sharp end, not a sudden end, just a slow, soft fade, like a candle burning low, or a song that trails off instead of stopping. So, if you're awake, you can let these words dissolve. And if you're already asleep, that's fine too. Either way, the night is yours now. The shadows belong to the past, and you belong to rest. Good night. Again and again. Good night. If you're still here, still drifting with me, then you've traveled a very long way. From demons and hags to monks and doctors to aliens and hat-wearing silhouettes. From clay tablets to glowing screens. From history to half-dreams. And now, there's nothing left to tell. Just the last soft exhale before the night finally closes. The fading of stories. Every story ends, even the ones that pretend to last forever. Myths fade, empires collapse, kings turn to dust, and even the hag herself, that stubborn nighttime archivist, grows tired. She slips away into the dark. The shadows fold back into the corners. The whispers dissolve into air. And what's left? Only breathing, only silence, only you. Time yawns. Maybe time itself is tired now. Imagine the centuries yawning, stretching, curling up like a giant animal. The ages that once roared with battles and sermons and panics are now drowsy, sinking down. History wants to nap, and in its dreams, it remembers its own night terrors, because even time can't fully escape shadows. But it rests, anyway, the way everything must, eventually. The last corridor. We've walked through the corridor of sleep paralysis many times now, opened all the doors, looked into every shadowed room. And here, at the very end, there's only one more door. Behind it is nothing frightening. No hag, no demon, no hat man. Just a bed. Soft. Waiting. The bed is yours. The silence is yours. The night is yours. A whisper of gratitude. It's strange, isn't it? To feel thankful for fear. But maybe that's the odd legacy of paralysis. It frightens, but it also connects. It isolates, but it also unites. It hurts, but it always lets go. So tonight, even if the shadows visit, maybe you can thank them. Thank them for being history's most consistent companions. Thank them for reminding you that you share something with everyone who has ever lived, from clay tablet carvers to Reddit posters. And then tell them, gently, that it's time for them to leave. The world without weight. Imagine a night without weight. No hag, no chest pressure, no frozen limbs, just a body sinking into the mattress, lighter and lighter, until you feel like you could drift right through the floor. That's the gift the night sometimes gives. And maybe, just maybe, you're already feeling it now. Shadows become dust. The shadows that once frightened entire civilizations are not eternal. They turn to dust like everything else. Dust on a clay tablet, dust on a woodcut, dust on a Victorian feather bed. And one day, even the stories themselves will be dust. But tonight, they've been alive, one last time, whispered in the dark, passed from me to you, from old voices to new ears. And now, softly, they can settle. The last drift. So let's do it one last time. Breathe. In, out. In, out. Picture the room dissolving, the bed dissolving, even your body dissolving, until all that's left is a gentle hum. A hum that carries you forward or downward or nowhere at all. You're not trapped, you're not haunted, you're simply floating. And the shadows? They've gone home. They've clocked out. They've hung up their cloaks and their fedoras and gone to bed themselves. The final good night. And now, we've truly reached the end. No more history, no more speculation, no more hags, demons, or aliens. Just quiet. Just sleep. So I'll whisper this once more and then let the silence take over. Good night. Good night. Good night.